Today our mission is to create a type of drawing I'm calling a diagrammatic rendering. And the idea here is to create an architectural drawing that is a sort of study drawing. It is not necessarily photorealistically rendered, but is in some ways more of a study of materials, lighting, spatial composition, architectonics, all that kind of good stuff, without kind of getting bogged down in the needs of a photorealistically rendered model. And here's some examples that I pulled off of Pinterest. One of the typical things that you see, first of all, the kind of environment that these are put in is often quite sketchy or non-existent, or in this case just suggested. Frequently there's kind of a regular cropping. These are not meant to be photographs. These are meant to be kind of expressive drawings. Sometimes there's even Photoshop filters added to materials to make them more interesting. And these drawings do not have to be of an entire building. They can be kind of selected pieces of a building. And even if it is an entire building, there are very frequently diagrammatic annotation, in this case, something indicating sun exposure. Again, it's sort of architectural in that it does show building geometry and a suggestion of materials, but the purpose of the drawing is to explain how the project functions in one way or another, even if it's just to show the kind of programmatic relationships between different spatial elements. These types of drawings, because they're kind of a mix of real three-dimensional representation and diagrammatic examination, they make for a great type of architectural drawing. For this particular project, we are giving you the option of using a good old Revit project. In this case, I am offering up one of Revit's samples as a possibility, but you can of course always use one of your own projects, but you can also use SketchUp. And that is fine because either one of these programs offers the ability to export images in high resolutions that will be good enough for us to use in our Photoshop exercise. But what I will do here in this video is mainly focus on Revit, partly because it's much more tricky to control the perspective and the view characteristics in Revit. SketchUp is actually designed to help you create dramatic views, so it's a little bit easier. There are a couple of ways you can get yourself a nice view. Now, this is a huge project, and so part of the challenge is getting that view of just the stairway, which is what we'd like to focus on. Now, there's always the good old insert a camera option, and I'll click on the camera tool, click and drag, and you always want to drag that focal point as far as possible so that you don't get any unusual cropping in the distance. Now here's the default kind of view that you get from Revit. You can, of course, change its proportions just by clicking and dragging on the crop region, make it taller. Some images are, in fact, better taller as opposed to more horizontally oriented. Now, the other thing you can do is call up this steering wheel, or navigation wheel as it's properly called. Just click on this. If you're not seeing this full steering navigation wheel, be sure to click the options down arrow here and check full navigation wheel. And this, the way it works is you can click and drag on any of these options and it will change what you're looking at. Now, in this case, I'm not exactly sure what I want, so I'm just going to kind of modify the view. Maybe a one-point perspective could be more interesting of this stair. I don't particularly like the walk tool just because it tends to go a little fast. I believe you can slow it down. But pan and orbit are also handy. Now, the problem with orbit, and you will find this even if you're just orbiting using the shift key and clicking and dragging the scroll wheel, is that it tends to orbit around the entire model. So be sure to select some element that you want to orbit around. If you don't have anything selected, it will orbit the entire model typically. And in this case, I happen to be looking at the center of the model. So you'll want to be careful about that. So in this case, I'm coming up with a view that I kind of like, that's more vertically oriented. And I'm going to stretch it out so that I can see a little bit more of the stair. It's okay, but I'm not sure I like it all that much. So let me show you another way that you can create a perspective view. So in plan view, you'll want to select the elements that you want to see, kind of isolated from the project. I've held down Control to select the two parts of the stair. And then I can use this special tool, the section box tool. It's up here on the toolbar. And it will crop away the entire model. And the way it does this is with a special tool called a section box, and pretty much every 3D view can have one of these. And it's just a box that kind of controls visibility of elements in the project. So I can crop away all sorts of elements in the building. It's 3D. I can rotate by or orbit by holding down Shift and clicking and dragging the scroll wheel, just like with a regular perspective. So this alone can make a pretty interesting type of drawing. You can force it to be in, say, elevation view, but for our purposes, I think I'm going to go with a skewed view. Now it's important to not mess up some of your views as you modify them. This is actually the default 3D view, so I'm going to right-click on it and choose Duplicate so that I have a copy. And I can even rename this copy something like axonometric. And the reason I do this is this overall axonometric view, the one where I created it originally, I'm going to turn off the section box in that view. And this can be a very useful view for your project as it shows the entire building. Back in my partial axonometric view, you will want to modify this view to look like something we can use for our project. And first of all, I'm just going to go with a hidden line view. And I'm also going to hide these level indications because I don't need them. So I can just right-click on them, hide in view, and hide the entire category. Now, if you have a view with stuff in the way, in this case, here's a perspective view with this kind of very unfortunate column right in the middle, you can do a number of things. I could right-click on it, and I could hide either the element or the entire category. But another fun trick is I can override what this element or what the entire category of columns looks like. I'm just going to go by element, and a menu pops up, and what I can do is I can make the surface transparent. Hit apply. Maybe that's a little too transparent. I'm not sure I like it that way. I think I'll just hide it. There are a couple of other things we can do to clean up this view for our export to Photoshop. One of them is change the line weight of different elements. You can go to the Modify tab, and there is a special Linework tool, and I can make individual lines different weight than they are currently by just clicking on them. I've chosen wide lines, and you can see how by just changing a few lines, it makes my drawing a little bit easier to read. It just gives you kind of these depth cues. Doesn't always work real well because the lines then become kind of opaque and sit on top of other things. But it is a great way to kind of bring out a little bit of depth in your project, because once you get to Photoshop, you won't really have the ability to make these changes. Photoshop is not a three-dimensional modeler, it's a two-dimensional modeler. Another thing that you can change is the surface pattern that displays on the floors and on the columns. The way you change that is through this Visibility and Graphic Overrides menu. And I'll just click on that menu, and in that menu, there are all sorts of essentially layers, AutoCAD style layers that you can modify. For example, here's the walls. I could also modify the floors. I can hold down Control, by the way, to select more than one of these layers. I don't know if I see the roof here, but if I did, I could select that too. Anyway, you can modify a number of things, including the projection pattern and the cut pattern. I could also add transparency if I wanted to, but I'll just come in here and I'm going to modify the surface pattern to have basically no pattern. And here you can see, once you hit apply, that it all disappears. Looks like I got the stairs, but I missed the columns. I'll have to grab that layer as well. And you can see here it looks a little sharper, but I still don't like this perspective. I want to see more of the stairs. So here's another trick if you're just not getting quite what you want out of your particular view. I have duplicated my partial axonometric and called it a cutaway perspective. And now in this view, I can come in and in the view properties, which you see when you have nothing selected, I can change the projection mode to perspective. And just like that, I have turned my axonometric into something a little more dynamic. And this is a perspective view. I can use all of my perspective tools, including my favorite thing, the navigation wheel, to rotate, orbit, do all those fun, good things here. Another thing which you'll find, depending on where your view was created, that it might be a little narrow or wide in field of view. This is a little wide for me, a little heavily distorted. I can change the focal length, which is essentially the camera, how wide a field of view the camera has. I'll just click this increase or decrease. Now you'll say, oh wait, you're zooming way in. Well, what this is doing, it's actually narrowing the camera focus. And I'll hit escape to stop doing that, and then zoom back out again. And there we go. That's a little less distorted. I think it's a little more in keeping with what I'm trying to do in this project. Once you have the view composed as you like, you can come in and change the line weights as you see fit, and also other things like perhaps you want to change the fill pattern here on your poche. I'm going to change that in Photoshop, so I'm not so worried. Also, I am noticing that there is no fascia drawn to connect the height of the ceiling with the face of the floor here. I think I'll add that in Photoshop as well. Now, before we go any further, we should check and see how much of this view we're going to get when we export. The way to find that out is to go to turn on the crop region. And oh, look at that, it's teeny tiny. The crop region determines what will get shown. In fact, if I turn on the crop region, you see how I'm not really seeing much of my project. And I can make it bigger just by clicking and dragging. Note that with the crop region selected, as I zoom in and out, it is zooming around that crop region and it won't affect the perspective view. So I think I'll crop it so that I see the entire project. I'm going to hide this section box, even though it will not show up in the export, but I think it gives me a little bit of a sense of what this is going to look like. Now, I have made several duplicate views of my original perspective. Each one is exactly the same perspective. And you, as I mentioned, you don't want to change your orbit or your panning. So if you want to zoom in on any of these views, by all means, select that crop region and use that so that you don't change them. Anyway, each view I can add or modify a number of different graphic display options just to give myself some layers to play with when I get to Photoshop. Each of these I will export independently. So first of all, to get to the graphic display options, just click on that option and it will bring up your graphic display options view. And this looks just like the override graphics view element by element menu that we saw earlier. Now, first of all, we are going to smooth the lines with anti-aliasing. And what that will do is it'll give you a little richer drawing, a little sharper, a little less zigzagginess. Now, I can play with any number of these. I've created one that's has just transparency. Sometimes this is really interesting. I'll drag this way up and hit apply. And now you see how you can see through objects. I might not need it everywhere because this is getting pretty confusing, but maybe that'll make an interesting effect on these slabs. So I would save that view. Another one that's really fun is sketchy lines. And I'll just drag these up and hit apply. I am not a big fan of the sketchy lines, mainly because I feel like they look better in SketchUp. But here we are in Revit. This is as good as it gets. I probably won't use this as a layer in my project just because they're a little muddy. Another one that I like is this ambient shadows. And what this will do is it'll give me a little bit of surface on here, a little bit of gradient. By all means, I could add that later on, but that does provide a little bit of kind of depth. The shadows in this particular view are going to be very disorienting because there's no building back behind the model, so I'm going to leave those off. Finally, another one that you can change, again, it may or may not be helpful in your project. You can add in a gradient or even an image in the background. Now, I don't like to use an image because I find them very difficult to place. I'd rather just do that in Photoshop. But a gradient, and I'll hit apply here, this can be very useful because this has the horizon line. And I'm going to need that in my Photoshop composition, or at least it's highly likely that I will need it, even for very basic effects. You can control the colors and whatnot here. To export this beautiful masterpiece of a view, I would recommend printing it to a PDF. Now, the reason I like to do that is because I have Adobe PDF, the Adobe PDF Creator on my computer, so it absolutely makes my life a lot easier. If you don't have that, you can export to an image. Just make sure you choose a very high resolution for that. Now, for me, let's check our page setup first. And what it's going to do, it's almost certainly going to be using vector processing. The view, in this case, it's probably landscape, although it doesn't really matter. You do want to make sure that it is set to fit to page and that the raster quality is the highest it can be. One other setting here is this hide crop boundaries option. What this will normally do is it will not show this black line around the perimeter of your view, but I do find that sometimes that's really nice to have in these perspective compositions. Definitely if there's kind of a shaded horizon line, it makes a nice termination to that. But for interior elevations, you can override the graphics of that thing and make it a nice heavy line, and then that will, if you print it to a PDF with the crop boundaries visible, it will absolutely look a lot nicer. The other thing you're going to want to do is check the PDF settings of it's like a printer. You can change the quality level. Now in this case, it's just set to standard quality. Well, we want the best. We want a high quality print. We also want to change the page size. The reason that we want to do this is that the print will be high quality, but it'll be only 8.5 by 11. That won't get us a whole lot of pixels. So I'm going to choose Arch D, which is a 24 by 36 wide sheet. And the reason for this is that it will allow us to get to stretch this image onto that large sheet. And that will just smooth out our lines that much more. Finally, it's always a good idea to check your preview. Now, in our case, if I click that, it will give me an error message that says, hey, I'm using raster printing options instead because there's shading in here. That's fine. In fact, I'm going to tell it not to show me that menu again. And here's a preview of what it's going to look like. This is not the highest resolution, so some of the weird fringing will go away when we do our final version. But you can see this is supposed to be a giant 24 by 36 piece of paper, and it has centered it on that page. So you just click Print to get you back to the main menu, and OK to save it onto your computer. And just to give equal time to those of us who like SketchUp, you can absolutely take your SketchUp model, apply different styles to these scenes. As before in Revit, you'll want to make an exact copy of that base scene. But each of these can be a very interesting layer to apply in Photoshop, including grayscale and the transparency. And the advantage of SketchUp is that if you just don't like the project I gave you, you can go and get one off of the 3D warehouse, which of course has millions of cool models that you can just load into your project. Anyway, you're just going to go to the view that you want to export and go to File, Export, 2D Graphic. And the advantage of this is you can choose the type of file that comes out. So we could choose PDF, or PNG is also a good style to choose. It has a good balance of quality and density. By the way, you can also choose DWG. If you are into Adobe Illustrator, you could export the lines and modify them in Illustrator as DWG. But anyway, I'm going to choose PNG, and there are a number of options. The most important thing here is we want to get a lot of pixels. So I'm going to change the image size to be something much larger. Even 6,000 or 7,000 pixels is fine. And you see how it adjusts the height accordingly. The line scale, if your lines are a little too wimpy when you export, you can modify this by changing the number to be a little higher. Be sure to check anti-alias, just like in Revit. That helps with smoothing out lines. Finally, transparent background. Now, in this view, it's basically black and white, so I would end up with just lines and nothing else if I had a transparent background. If I had a more solid view, I would probably check that so that I can see, for example, through windows. And this is the same as the effect, the alpha channel effect that we see in Revit. So click OK and save your files onto your computer. Before you go too far, you want to make sure your drawing is set up to print. To do that, go to Image, Image Size. And what you'll see is a description of the size of the image and how many pixels it has per inch. Now for us, you'll only need 200 pixels per inch. So right now it's set to 300. That was our high resolution setting in Adobe when we printed it. So you can absolutely drop this down to 200, and you'll just want to make sure when you do that you check this resample button and that you choose one of these options. And for our case, probably the smoother gradients is going to work pretty well. We don't necessarily need all the detail because some of that may give us a little bit of pixelation. Anyway, then just change the number to 200 and, oh, not 2. And what you'll see is the file size has decreased from 222 megabytes, which is a pretty big file, down to 43.9. And if you are experiencing an issue where, say, the computer is telling you you don't have any space on your scratch disk for various things, what it means is maybe your file is just a little bit too large. Now, for our case, 24 by 18 is just fine, but having that higher resolution export from Revit just gives us those pixels in case we want to get them later on. So I have opened up my exports in good old Photoshop, and when you have multiple exports, you can place them on top of each other. I'm going to choose the Place Embedded option. You can also place Linked, and that will allow people to edit the original file, and it will show up as kind of a reference within your drawing. And you browse to select your image and choose Place. When the drawing is a PDF file, it will give you a little preview about what you want to input. If it's a multi-page document, obviously you would choose the page that you want. And once it's placed in the drawing, you will see a big X. And then up at the top of the screen, it is asking you, do you want us to place that drawing into your project, basically accepting the transformation. And you click the checkbox to add it. Now, how do you see each of these things you've placed in your project? Well, that is here on the Layers menu. And what you will see, the base layer that I opened up here was the ambient shadows layer. And then I've added all these other layers here. Each time I imported something, it became a separate layer. Now, to turn them on and off, I can click the little eyeball. So here's my ambient shadows layer. Here's my base layer with just the poche. Here is one that I exported from Revit with consistent colors. Here's a sketchy view. And then here's the view with some transparency. One of the simplest ways that you can combine layers, a little technique. Let's say I like the consistent colors view, but I want some sketchy lines on top. Well, each layer has what's called a blending mode, which controls how it interacts with the layers below. And if you have a layer with a lot of black and white and not a lot of color, the simplest layer blending mode you can choose is multiply. And what this will do is it will basically make anything white invisible and anything black will be opaque. And these blending modes are awfully handy, especially if you have a lot of different colors. Now for us, most of these are actually very photographic in nature, but for probably the ones you're going to use the most are screen and multiply. However, sometimes you can scroll down through the list and take a look at the interesting effects that you can get. For example, anything white here is subtracting from the layer below and we get kind of a black background. Another great technique is fading one layer into another. So for example, I have this layer here with a lot of line work and it's very white. And then I have this layer below it that has shadows. I can selectively erase part of this layer to reveal the layer below. But what that means is I need to use some of my selection tools. Now there are a couple of different ones. If you look up on the upper left of your toolbar, you will find a couple of different ones, a rectangular marquee, an elliptical marquee, single row. There are also a number of lassos, including a smooth lasso, a polygonal lasso, and a magnetic lasso, which looks for differences in color. Now, I'm just going to stick with a basic selection. And I have drawn a rectangular area on my base layer here. Now, I can't erase any parts of it until I rasterize the layer. Now what you do, you right click on the layer and choose rasterize from the menu that pops up. And any of these imported layers, to edit them, you're going to have to rasterize them. But now I have made my base layer the current layer by just clicking on it. See how it's highlighted? And I just hit delete. And now it reveals the model below. I'm going to tap Control-D to deselect my area. Those kind of marching ants are a little distracting. You can see that's kind of a fun way to modify your drawing to make it a little more interesting, increase the focus in the central area. Back at my original selection, what if I want to erase the outer area? I can just right-click on my selection and choose Select Inverse. And what you'll see is now the marching ants are around the perimeter of the drawing. And if I hit the delete button, it should remove the outer part of the drawing. Finally, if you want to smooth the perimeter of that selection, you can right-click on it. And I still have my selection tool activated. Right-click on it and choose Feather. Another great way to add interest to your drawing is to manipulate the way layers look with another type of layer called an adjustment layer. And I'm here in my layers menu, my layers dialog, and you'll see a little kind of half circle, half moon. Click on that. That is the new adjustment layers menu. And there's some very simple things that you can do. For example, if I add a brightness contrast adjustment layer, what I can do is then adjust the brightness or the contrast. That's exactly what the layer adjustment says, by just using the sliders that pop up. And you'll see that the menu, the layer pops up here on the list. If I just double click on the circle, it will bring back up those adjustments, and I can control the layer very easily. These layers also can be turned on and off, and just like that I can experiment with different sorts of effects. For example, another very effective effect is a black and white filter. And what this will do is it will make your drawing, you guessed it, black and white. And this can be a very interesting layer in your stack. Again, you can turn it on and off, but when you turn on some of your other layers, you can see now I'm fading from an interesting colored kind of line image to a black and white image. And that's a very fun effect. And these layer effects, these adjustment layers, can be stacked on top of each other. I'm just going to add a new one that is an invert effect. And what this does is it makes everything that was black into white and everything that was white into black. Finally, one that is very handy in a situation like this where it's starting to get a little too dark. There is a adjustment layer called levels. And what this allows you to do is you can control where the kind of midpoint of your drawing is. Now, any of these layers can be turned on and off individually. You can also click and drag them into the little rubbish bin there to make them go away. Finally, you should note that layers are opaque. So when I turn on one of these layers, it will block out elements below. But also, if I drag this down in the list, these adjustment layers will affect anything below them. So I'll want to drag that one back up in the list. And there's several ways you can avoid problems like that when you want to move things up and down. The simplest is to select these layers, and then you'll just combine them into one layer. Just choose Merge Layers from the list that pops up. And now the layer is all on its own. I can turn it on and off and manipulate it independently. One thing Photoshop is great at is painting. It has a paint bucket over here on the toolbar, and it will paint the foreground color into a number of different types of options. First of all, let me click on the paint bucket. And maybe I'll paint this ceiling up here. It feels a little dark to me. I'd like it to have a little gray. So I can choose the color by just picking on the color tool here. And I can also use this eyedropper to slurp up whatever color I want to use. I'm just going to use the ceiling down here on the first floor or second floor, whatever that is. And now you can see it's the foreground color. And you can switch the foreground and background colors if you want, just by clicking those arrows. But otherwise, when you click the paint bucket, what it will do, it has a number of properties that determine how it decides where the paint should go. First of all, your current layer is where the paint will go. So even though I want to paint on the ceiling, I think I'm going to make a new layer using my new layer button and paint onto that layer just in case I mess up or I want a little more fine control. Now up here at the top of the screen there are several options for the paint bucket. What happens is when you click on the paint bucket and then you click in an area that you want the paint to go, it will look at the pixel you clicked on and say, oh, that's a little bit of red, a little bit of green, and a little bit of blue. And it looks at the pixel next door, and if that pixel matches it within a certain tolerance, then it will select that one too. Now, if you have the contiguous button selected, it will select any pixel that matches that original until it hits a boundary, until it hits a line that does not match that pixel, and then it will stop. You can also tell it to select all layers. So in this case, I'm drawing on one layer, but I want it to recognize the ceiling on the other layer. So I'll just click in here, and what you'll see is it fills in that whole area. And like I mentioned, I have this on a layer, which I can turn on and off. I can also change the opacity to lighten it up a little bit if it's a little darker than I like. Another way to paint is to select an area or a color and paint that. Now I want to change this poche. I'm not really digging the whole blue look, and I can use one of my selection tools. Now in this case there's one called the magic wand. I'll just click on it over here. Now what you'll see up here is that the options are very similar to the paint bucket. There's an anti-alias button, which you should usually leave checked. There's a tolerance, 32 is default. A lower tolerance number means it will not accept colors that are not an absolute matches, whereas you can set this very high and it'll select pretty much any color that's close enough. You can also select or deselect contiguous like before. So I'm going to click on the, and I'm going to choose sample all layers. I get this blue, and I'm going to click on it, and what it should do is find all the blue in the drawing, which it did. You can see here that it didn't quite get everything, and I can come in using any of my selection tools to add to this selection. Just hold down Shift to add, and hold down Control, or no, Alt, I believe, to subtract from your selection. Now, if I hold down the Shift key, it will force this tool to go in the orthogonal, which is nice because obviously straight lines are important in architectural settings. Anyway, you see how it has added it in. Now, if I wanted there to be, say, a line along this edge, I could deselect that, again, just by holding down the Alt button, and maybe I'll use a rectangle to deselect a little line here. Now, before I go any further, that was a pretty complicated selection to make. I want to save that selection just in case I want to come back to it. You can do this by going to the Select pull-down menu and choose Save Selection. You can label it in here, and you can load it back in if you ever want to recover it. There are a few tricks. If you want, you can extract that color from this layer. With my selection tool active, I can right-click on it and choose Layer via Cut. And that will remove it from the current layer and make a whole new one. I could also do Layer via Copy. However, I'm just going to make a new layer, call it Poche, and now I'll dump the color paint in there that I think will look the best. Sometimes an area that you have just kind of drawn in to fill in, maybe it needs a boundary line around it. And let me show you what I mean. I'm going to deselect by holding Control D, and it would be nice to have a line there. I'm going to reselect what I just selected, and I can add a stroke onto that line just by choosing the Edit pull-down menu and Stroke. And you'll have to choose a color that's going to look like it'll show up, so black works just fine, and choose a dimension that you think will work. I think 3 pixels will probably be okay. And you can see the line along the edge. Sometimes you need to get a sort of more realistic material. Even if it's not 100% accurate, you just want to kind of suggest a material, but you want to make it look like it's in perspective and maybe having an irregular boundary. And in this case, I want to put some tile here on this landing just to kind of suggest what's going on there. And I went to the good old internet and found myself a seamless image of a tile that I'd like to use. And what I can do, I can select that tile, Control A, and make a new brush out of it, a new brush pattern, sorry, and just choose Edit, Define Pattern. And you'll see a little menu, and you can call it Floor Tile. Back here in my main drawing, I have made myself a new layer for that tile, and I've drawn myself a nice big rectangle that I can fill with that tile pattern. I just click the paint bucket and make sure that instead of painting the foreground color, now I'm painting a pattern. And you'll see right next to that a selector where you can choose any patterns that you might have loaded into your project. And in this case, here's my tile pattern. I can select it, and I should be able to paint it in this space. Now I've got a box filled with that paint, and it's sitting here below the poche level, which is handy because now I can see where the perspective lines should go. This is a pattern with a very recognizable perspective to it. So I'm going to need to distort it. And there's a special tool, you guessed it, called Distort, and it's under the Transform pull-down, Transform menu, which is under the Edit pull-down menu. And what that'll allow me to do, I can grab each one of these grips here, and I can kind of stretch the pattern to fit the perspective distortion that you see in your view. And it might take several minutes to get it just right. There are other transform tools under here. including skew, which allows you to kind of grab an edge as well. And this is a great way to kind of match up your pattern with the edge of the poche, and that'll get you more or less what you're looking for. So here's my skewed pattern. And I want it to match this landing shape. What I can do is find a layer where I see that landing shape, and then I can basically use my magic wand tool, select the area I want, making sure to get any little islands that might be sneaking through. Now that I have that selection visible, I can come back and turn on some of my layers, including my tile pattern, make that my current layer, and there's a special feature which allows you to cut out basically a kind of mask out of your whatever's on that layer. And because I have it selected, all I have to do is click the Add Layer Mask button, and it will crop the pattern based on whatever that outline is. And you can even see here in the Layers menu, there's a little black area indicating what is not visible, and then a tiny little white area where what is visible it shines through. I can still come back by clicking on my white box here with the material, and I can actually continue to make edits to that material. I could move it around and whatnot. But basically, I have created this mask. To release the mask, by the way, you can just drag it to the trash. I'm not going to do that, though, because I like my mask. You can also add to the mask by painting either white or black. So, for example, if I come in here and paint black on my mask, I'll just use a paintbrush. By painting either black or white, it will reveal or remove elements from my mask. Just be sure to click back on the image tile to continue drawing with other elements, or your Photoshop will continue to draw on the mask layer, which we don't want to do. Now, the drawing is a little light for my taste. I think I want to add just some texture in the background, a little bit of color. I'm going to make myself a nice new blank layer here, drag it onto the top of the list for now, and I can use, say, a brush tool to get some interesting effects. There are all sorts of brushes available, not quite as many as, say, Illustrator, but you can see here, here's one of the splatter brushes which is available in Illustrator, and it will paint whatever color is the current foreground color. So let's give ourselves a nice blue. And you can also, just like in Illustrator, you can change the size of the brush to be bigger or smaller, so we can get kind of a different effect here. Oh, very nice. And there are many other types of brushes as well. Now, of course, I don't really want to see all this on top of my architecture, so we can use our layers to help us out. And there are many other brushes, by the way. I can drag this down to the bottom of the layer list here, see if that masks out any of it. Now, I actually do want it to show up above some of this other stuff. So what I can do, instead of using my layers to mask it, I can come in and use that same masking technique that we used before, where, let's say, for example, where the building is, I want to leave it as visible. I could make a selection area and apply my layer mask to that. You can see here I've got basically the building area selected, and the opposite area, this outer area, is unselected. Now I'll turn back on my bubbly, dotty kind of layer. I'm going to make my favorite thing, the layer mask. And you'll see how it cuts out that middle. Now, I actually want to see a little bit of my pattern. This is just kind of tone. So I can come in here, click on the mask, and let me bring that selection back by choosing Select, Reselect. But now I'm going to select the inverse so that I have this inner area, and I'm going to fill it with gray. Now, when you fill it with gray, what happens is it lets half of the color through. And again, this is just an option here on the Edit Fill menu. And I'll just click OK. And now you can see how it has let some of the splatter through without letting all of it. And again, this is a layer, so I can come back, click on the color to continue editing. And I can lower down the opacity if I want to soften it. It will lower down both the opacity of the solid version and the masked version. Finally, if we're coloring in stuff, and I guess I left a part here uncolored, you can add a layer that is just an entire layer of solid color. It's just an adjustment layer. And what's nice about using these adjustment layers is they are adjustable, which is to say, here's my blue layer. I can drag it to the bottom of my list so that it shows up underneath the other layers. And then if I don't like the blue, I can click on it and change the color. And I would probably come in and do my layer mask thing again, select. So here I've given a light tone to the background of my board and some splatter patterns. I'd probably want to add a little bit more, but this is pretty good. So people will add a lot of livelihood to your drawing. You'll just want to make sure when you search for people, and I use Bing because when you click on the image, it will open up all on its own. Google apparently won't do that. But make sure you filter it and that you search for images that are either large or extra large. These are just going to look a lot better in your drawing. When you click through on the drawing, it will open it up. Typically on a PC, it will show up as black. That's the transparent background. The Mac version will show up as white as the background. So just right-click on that largest version of the image and choose Save Image As. You can save it onto your computer. I have placed them here in my main drawing and embedded them. Obviously they're a little big, so maybe we want to make them smaller. Holding down Shift, by the way, forces them to adjust in a non-proportional manner. Letting go of, or holding Shift will allow them to not be distorted. Now, adding in shadows really help with wetting the figure into the view. The simplest thing is to add it using a drop shadow. Here that is under the Layer Style menu, under Layer. And there's one that actually just says Drop Shadow. I don't always like the way they look because it drops a shadow behind all parts of their body, which is a little weird. So you can also just make a blank layer and use a nice soft brush and kind of paint in a shadow like under their feet. This can be very effective just so long as the layer that you're painting on is underneath their layer. I tend to use a lower opacity just to make it seem a little softer. Just click the gradient tool. I am in my mask now, and I'm going from black to white. So black being opaque, white being transparent, and make the gradient go in the direction of perspective. And there you go. You have a nice shadow fading off. Would you rather have a reflection? Well, just get rid of that effect of the overlay, and now you have a reflection on the ground. And you can even make it look ripply using some of the effects that are available in Photoshop. Just go to Filter, Blur, and I'm just going to choose a Gaussian blur for now. And the Gaussian blur, the more you blur it, the more it looks like the floor is kind of in need of polish. And this is a very simple way. You can do this in glass or in other things to get a really nice effect. So our drawing could use a few more things just to make it a little more interesting. One of them is what I like to call atmospherics, things like sunbeams or narrow beams of light. And I've selected an area here that would be kind of an approximate amount of direction that the light would be coming into this space. And I can come in and add a gradient to that layer. I'll just click on the gradients tool, however, because by default, the gradient goes from the foreground to the background color. Now I've got them both set to white, but if you go to the second gradient here in the gradients menu, it's foreground color to transparent. What you'll see is now instead of going from one color to the other, part of it is transparent. If the gradient is going the wrong way, just double click on the gradient in the layers menu and you should see a menu pop up where you can change the angle of it And now it looks like the sun is coming down from above. And of course, if you want it to come from a window, you can make it go sideways or have any other sort of effect. Another fun effect that you can apply that's sort of atmospheric is what's called a lens flare. And lens flares are basically what it would appear like if there was kind of a shiny object in your project. And it's simple to do. First of all, make yourself a nice blank layer and dump black paint on the layer so it's completely black. And then we're going to use a filter. It's under the filter pull down menu, render, lens flare. And these filters are, by the way, really great ways to add a little bit of texture to a solid color, make it look artsy, perhaps hand-drawn, sketchy. There are all sorts of different filters, and there's a whole filter gallery that you can use. Anyway, I'm going to use lens flare. And you can see here it looks sort of like there was a camera, and you can click and drag on it. And in fact, there's a number of different ones that are kind of presets that you might try. And again, there may not be anything shiny in your project, and maybe it doesn't make sense. But you can also control how bright this thing is. And click OK, and it will apply it to this layer. You might say, well, what does that get me? Well, we have used the multiply blending mode quite frequently, but we haven't used the screen mode quite as much. And what this does, it's basically the opposite of multiply. Anything that's black becomes invisible, and anything white becomes transparent. And I can even modify this lens flare. I can make it larger or smaller. I can move it around. And you can lower the opacity if it's a little bit strong. I think it looks best up on the window where it appears like it's creating a shine off of the glass. The last thing we want to do is add some annotation to our drawing, and this includes things like title and also notes and arrows or other pointers to indicate different materials in our project. And text really is pretty straightforward in most projects. You just, or most programs, just click on the text tool, you set the font size and the font and any characteristics that might have bold or whatnot. And then there's justification, left, right, or whatever. And then you draw a box and you fill it with text. Photoshop will add in its own placeholder text, but you can obviously change that. And text can be moved around. It's an object just like anything else. And you can double click on it with the text tool and come in and edit it if it's too big or too small. And you can add layer effects. For example, we can go to layer style and choose drop shadow. And we can add in a drop shadow. We've done this before. There's all sorts of different adjustments, and you can make it darker or lighter and change the angle that looks good on the drawing. I don't know why, but this always looks nice. There are also some effects that you can apply that are specific to text. For example, I'm going to right-click on the layer and choose Warp Text. And there's all sorts of ways that you can kind of warp it, you guessed it, by just choosing a different option. I don't know. Sometimes these things get a little out of control, but there definitely is a place for these types of adjustments. Here, we'll give it a little bit of a bend. You can even add a layer mask onto your text, and we can use our gradient technique to make it fade away. Just click the gradient tool, and then click and drag your cursor to get a little bit of a gradient at the bottom of the stairs. Now, you often want to have a note where you have a word and you want to point at some sort of object. There really isn't a great way to draw arrows that are very nice in Photoshop. You can, of course, go to the internet and get some there, but I'm going to recommend using Illustrator, Adobe Illustrator. And here I have an Illustrator file, and it's just so easy to create these things. Here in Illustrator, you just draw an object, and you can give it a stroke of any sort that you want, and add arrowheads right at the end. And then just save that file, and you can load it right into Photoshop. Here in Photoshop, just choose File, Place Linked, and this is actually nice if you want to make any changes later on. And here's my arrows file. I'll place it. And of course, there are multiple artboards, so I'm going to choose the arrow that's the one for this project. And do note that these are objects like any others, so they do have they do follow the drawing order here in your project. And they can be modified like any other object. They can be rotated. I'll just hold down Shift to lock it in the orthogonal. And then you can move it around. Now, the only problem is it is a little difficult to manipulate because you can't stretch the line like you would in Illustrator. So what you need to do is rasterize the layer that the arrow is on. Just right click on it, and there's an option for rasterize the layer, and this just turns it into pixels. And now those pixels can be selected and modified. I'm just going to grab a section of the arrow and use my modify tool and stretch it right out. Just be sure to hold down Shift so the line doesn't get any thicker. And there you go. Commit to the transformation and you have a longer arrow. And of course these can be copied and moved around your drawing. So there's certainly more I could do to gussy up the drawing, some more people, maybe bring my line work forward again, or I could also work on making more interesting materials for the flooring or for the poche. But this is the basics of how you can create an annotated three-dimensional drawing without actually having to go and model the whole thing and render it on one of our modeling programs.